Welcome to the Indian Writers Forum conversation with the eminent writer Nayantara Sahgal. I'm Githa Hariharan. If I were to describe Nayantara Sahgal's lifetime work of several books of fiction, non-fiction, her journalistic writing, as well as her interventions in public space, the word that would be the most accurate is political. In fact, she has said that I cannot write if I do not write politically. She has said that politics is not some event out there, but her emotional mainspring, even if she's writing fiction. Nayantara Sahgal has just published a new novel called When the Moon Shines by Day. It's been published by Speaking Tiger. And like much of her work, this is a sharp, almost brutal political take on the India that is being transformed before our eyes. Thank you, Nayantara, for joining us. I thought we would begin with recalling the idea of India that you were witness to, your own family, your uncle Nehru, Gandhi. You actually describe it as the glittering aspiration called India. So would you start with that so that we have a context for talking about today?
Yes, I think what I meant by that was the struggle for freedom under Mahatma Gandhi, in which my parents were involved. And in fact, my father died of his 4th imprisonment under British rule. And this was an amazing period in Indian history, because I think it was the first time, certainly the first time in India, and definitely the first time in history, where class and mass fought together under the same banner. It had never happened before in any country. Gandhi brought together people in a way that cut across religion, region, class, gender, all the divisions. And so he created what then became the foundation of independent India. And this was such an extraordinary achievement to bring together this rich diversity, but which had been very diverse, into a unity which became the strong political unity that overthrew the British Empire.
You speak of you describe the solidarity then as a rugged idealism. You've used extracts from your mother's prison diary. Since we are hoping to also talk about what sort of solidarity we need today, shall we revisit how that solidarity, how that sense of inclusiveness happened?
Well, it happened in the way that I have described, where there was the star of freedom. And all these people were invited to join in that march to freedom. And it was a long march, 25 years or 26 years, in which people of all classes joined. And it was really the first classless venture that ever took place in any society. I have to emphasize that because it was an achievement which was unique. It had never happened before. And it took place because through Gandhi, people like us who had perhaps never had any communication with the rural areas or the masses, then were involved in organizing things together. I know my mother and father spent most of their time in rural areas. And of course, my uncle, Jawaharlal Nehru, traveled the length and breadth of India speaking to village audiences. Gandhiji himself did that. And it was the first time that brought town and village together. English-speaking people with people speaking the regional languages. And the slogans were across the board. There was Hindu Muslim Ek Ho. There was Bharat Mata Ki Jai. And Nehru often asked his village audiences, कि इसके क्या माने हैं? What does this mean? And then they would talk about what is Bharat Mata and what do we mean when we say Bharat Mata Ki Jai. And there was also the slogan Inqilab Zindabad. So across the board, there were these slogans which were all radical of their kind, emotional of their kind, and people of all classes were together, marching, young and old also.
And
together.
that India, that was the idea, what they saw when they said Bharat Mata, was secular, not uncontested, but what held people together was that it would be inclusive, it would be secular. If you could tell us something about, not of course Nehru's vision, but the vision that held all the freedom fighters together across the board.
Well, as I have said, it was this call to freedom that was the unifying factor. And Gandhiji had shown that this could be done non-violently, and therefore thousands of women could join into it. Now, if it had been a violent fight, perhaps that would not have been the case. But because it was a non-violent fight, Gandhiji invited the women of India to join it, and I think in 1932, perhaps about 30,000 women were in jail at that time, part of the struggle. So, and I don't mean Hindu women, I mean women of all classes and kinds. One of his leading followers was a Christian, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, and many of his comrades in the struggle were Muslim. Maulana Sahab Azad and Tayyab Ji, and some were Parsi. So the secularity came in the mix, in the fact that people came from all religions and all backgrounds to march with Gandhi. And well, to go off the track a little, if I may say that, and contrast it with the way elections are fought today. In the last election, our present Prime Minister had life-size images of himself on big screens. And I was thinking back to my childhood, where as a child I saw Gandhiji, a skinny old man, sitting on the ground. His voice didn't carry very far. Microphones didn't always work. But that man shook an empire. So, there was something very unique about India's struggle for freedom. Its secularity, its across the board class and mass meeting, the fact that it combined all the languages of India. I mean, there are patriotic songs in all Indian languages. Gandhiji's favorite hymn, Vaishnava Janato, was Gujarati, and through that he projected his image of what freedom meant, where he says that the Vaishnav is the man who can feel another's pain. That was the message of Gandhi. And of course, his prayer meetings were a combination of Muslim, Christian, and Hindu prayers. And even the Hindu prayer had his mantra, which was Ishwar Allah Tere Naam. So it was, there was the secularity for you, you know, yes, right across the board.
Well, if we sadly move from that point of glory and aspiration to where we are today, you know, when I began your novel, I thought it was going to be a kind of dystopia set in the future or near future, but then I realized that it's very much in the present, where about the only new label there is you've got something called the Directorate of Cultural Transformation. Would you tell us something about what happens to this glittering aspiration, not just in your novel, but in today's India?
Yes, from a huge inclusive idea of India, we are now being shrunk into a monoculture, which is called Hindu. But if you're a real Hindu like I am, I'm not only a Hindu by accident of my birth, I'm a believer. My religion matters to me. And so what is projected today as Hinduism is a travesty of Hinduism. Hindutva is a distortion of Hinduism, but that is what we are being shrunk into from this huge, enriched, sort of inclusive idea of India. And that's what's taking place today. And in the name of Hindutva, these other changes are taking place. Well, I mean, we know what changes are taking place. Debate has been crushed. Dissent has been outlawed. And we know what is happening to dissenters. There have been gunshot murders by passing vigilantes of writers and journalists. There have been mob lynchings of humble people, a poor blacksmith, a dairy farmer, who are doing their jobs. And they have been lynched by mobs on public thoroughfares within sight of the police. And Hindutva is keeping quiet about it. There's even a travesty of justice, an insane travesty of justice, I have to say, when the killers of all these people have not been punished, and the killers are roaming free to kill more people, while the victims or the victims' families are being declared the guilty party. So this is the change that is taking place before our eyes. And this transformation is not in the future. It's happening now. All of us are looking at it.
There's also a deepening of those old fault lines of caste, of gender, and in a way there are sort of grotesque new manifestations of it. One example, of course, is the flogging in Una. Would you say that with all these new distortions of what Indian culture is supposed to be about, obviously those old fault lines are only going to be deepened?
I'm not quite sure what fault lines means, but
caste and so on.
Yeah. No, you see, this idea of Hindutva maintains that India is Hindu. This is the country of Hindus. The Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs will be tolerated. The Muslims are our enemies. all these people are outsiders, but we will tolerate the Christians and the Buddhists and the Sikhs, but the enemy, which is Musalman, has to be told where his place is. If he's going to live in this country, he's here on sufferance. So that's the situation. Mm-hmm. And the fault lines certainly are deeper there. Mm-hmm. There's another fault line under this Hindutva, and which is developing, and I brought that into my book, the Dalits. Because Hinduism, as we know, is responsible for many crimes, but for two great crimes. One is sati, and the other is untouchability. And what is happening today, there's a kind of cow mania set in motion by the ruling party, where there's supposed to be cow rakshaks who are supposed to protect the holiness of the cow. And the Dalits recently rose up and declared, and it was a big uprising, nothing small, no little minor revolt, saying, the cow's your mother, you look after her, you deal with her, and they will not lift cow carcasses anymore. They made that quite plain. So there are this kind of fault lines which are raising a revolt of this kind among certain sections of people, the Dalits primarily, and this would have, I think, delighted the heart of Mahatma Gandhi and of Ambedkar.
You know, when I just spoke about the political earlier, I also should have added the ideological, because one of the very strong threads running through this novel is, of course, something that a lot of us are remembering these days, which is the German example. So you actually have a character, a German who's in India and says, well, our past is your future, and your novel suggests that it is already here. You know, can you talk a little about this parallel? You take it actually beyond the nation theory. It's a masculinist kind of narrative. It implies eugenics. It implies ethnic cleansing. Would you talk about this parallel?
Yeah, you see, the reason that I have brought the German comparison is partly based on fact, because, well, let me begin by saying that the Hindu Mahasabha was the ancestor of the BJP, of the RSS. There was no RSS back in 1925-26 when the Hindu Mahasabha was founded. But it's the same thing. It's descended from that mentality. And the Hindu Mahasabha was greatly enamored of the rise of dictatorship in Europe. I think in the 1920s, maybe Hitler was not yet in the saddle, but Mussolini was. And so representative of this Hindu Mahasabha had even gone to Italy and met
Munge.
I put him in the book.
Yes.
He had gone and met Mussolini. And Mussolini had advised him that from childhood, the mind must be trained for war, must be prepared for war. So why? Because the Hindu Mahasabha had always believed that Mahatma Gandhi was a bad event in India, because he emasculated the Indians through his nonviolence. He weakened them, he made them a no-good lot, you know, and that memory must be obliterated. That's why Nathuram Godse killed Gandhi, because that had to be wiped out. We had to become a militant nation. And the connection between the European dictatorships and the Hindu Mahasabha was very strong, and those were their icons. So that's why I brought in this German character.
With variations. At the end, he says,
well,
of course, there are Indian variations.
He's a
No, but it's
yeah.
true.
Yeah.
The point is that there are historical parallels,
yeah.
and because a lot of people will sort of defend the lack of parallel in a literal way, I think it's important to point out that, of course, for example, we have caste, you know, there it was race maybe. So these variations, and in fact the eugenic parallel, recently there was a suggestion.
Talking about caste, the director of cultural information, cultural transformation in my book, he says caste is a beautiful thing, you see, because through caste we have developed skills, you know, and we have refined skills to a great extent because of caste being carried from generation to generation. So there are 4 castes, and there are 4 outcasts. You know, the untouchable must remain so. But as far as eugenics are concerned, there was, under the Nazi rule, there was this experiment in eugenics to produce a superhuman race of Nazis, future Nazis, who would rule the world.
Aryans.
Aryans. And, you know, Hitler's slogan, when he began invading Czechoslovakia and Austria and so on, his slogan was, Europe today, tomorrow the world. And in order to rule the world, there had to be a superhuman race made up of Europe's master race, which would be the Aryan race. And there was, of course, no such thing, so it had to be produced through a scientific experiment where a certain type, the blonde, white-skinned, blue-eyed type, had to be produced. And so men and women, you know, in this experiment had to mate, and those children were kept in Nazi homes and so on. So I brought that on.
That's right.
But I was amazed while I was writing this book. There was an article, a small item in the newspapers, which said that there was some kind of experiment for Aryanization which had been begun in India.
That's right.
I read about that somewhere, and I couldn't believe that this was happening.
In fact, a lot of, fun was made of it on the social media. Sad fun, let me say. It was sort of tragicomic. A picture of a young white man saying that, you know, this is the kind of Hindu offspring we should produce. Nayantara, I wanted to, in a time when writers, filmmakers, artists, the cultural fraternity is vulnerable to being hounded, in fact, as you've said, even to being shot. But the whole range from self-censorship to murder. I think it's important to revisit what you've said throughout the book, and of course in your real life. You returned your Sahitya Academy Award in 2015. You spoke up against the emergency earlier and so on. That art has to be political, that it has to take sides. I think we'd like to hear from you on this.
You see, we are all political in the sense that we live in a political environment. Just as we live, the human race has different kinds of natural environment. So we have had different kinds of political environment, and I think human beings growing up in a particular environment then react to that, or their lives are affected, I should say, by that political environment. That's what I meant when I said we are all political. But certainly writers have not only not avoided it, but they have not been able to avoid it. Writers like Pinter, like Arthur Miller, like all the great Latin American writers whose writing has been political, and it has lasted for that reason, that it is reflecting a universal theme within its own context, and the human cost of that particular environment. So how can, even the feminist movement has used the word political, that the personal is the political. So there's no avoiding the political.
In fact, when you say the feminist movement, it occurs to me that there's an undercurrent of a women's narrative throughout the book. You come up with examples of not just discrimination, but active oppression, physical oppression of women throughout history. And that, of course, only gets exacerbated during the current times when you have a particular prevailing ideology. This was planned.
No, nothing in this book was planned. It just flowed. You know, there are two women's narratives here in the book. One is the oppression side and how women are controlled. But the other is, there are these four women who are close friends. There's a sisterhood of women, as it were. And one of the bonds between them is that they have never been taught to self-efface. You know, they express their views. So in that setup, there is this discussion about the fact that women are entitled to sexual satisfaction, which, you know, they probably through history have has been ignored. Sex has been a man's
prerogative.
Sport or prerogative.
Sport is probably more accurate.
Yes, I mean the husband's right and so on. So that aspect is there too. So we have two kinds of women: the very, the determinedly independent woman who knows her mind and does not give in to this, and the other side is the women who are responding to a Baba's call among us that Hindu women must have at least 5 children, at least 5 children. So there's a group, there's a fashionable lady who's the wife of a very important businessman who's very close to the ruling powers in the book. His wife decides to set an example and to influence her friends and to make pregnancy fashionable and glamorous. So instead of wearing a sari, which is a lot of bunch cloth around your tummy, the wrong place because the stomach grows, so she wants a wardrobe designed which will be glamorous, and that will induce women, persuade Hindu women to have more children. So there are these two.
This is actually the reverse of the propaganda that Hindus have 2 children and Muslims have 5 and they might outnumber us. So
yes, so to make the Hindu population grow.
I also wanted to mention this caste already, of course, has a spatial division in India, especially in rural India, but increasingly we're seeing this in our metros as well, that if you are a Muslim, for example, you might find it quite hard to rent a place. But in your novel, what we hope will not happen in the immediate future, there is complete ghettoization, and it's sort of like little regions, little areas which are kept aside for the Muslims. They have to, if they come to the mainstream areas, they have to have Hindu names and so on. So, you know, I wanted you to describe some of this, which is, half of it is here. If you're a pessimist, you'll say 3/4 of it is here. But you actually take it the entire way, and that is the warning.
That what might happen.
Yes.
Yeah, a story is a story, so one thing comes out of another.
But the story is very close to reality, which is why we have to take it seriously.
All stories come out of reality, but they go their own way. The first part of your question was about despair, or what?
The sort of spatial division, which is, it formalizes the fact that you are different, you're the other.
So what you are asking me is that cause for worry?
Of course it's cause for worry, but you wanted to push it a little further as a kind of, this is a sign of, you know, we're already looking at signs of things to come.
Well, actually, I don't know if that would happen. I really don't. That is, of course, my imagination. But the fact is that enough is happening. In the emergency of 1975, we knew that we're in a dictatorship because the opposition had been put in jail, all debate had been crushed, the Constitution had been amended to take away our right to life and liberty. So it was a clear dictatorship, and we knew exactly the situation we were in. Now today, it's much more dangerous because all that is happening under the guise of democracy. We are told we're a democracy, and yet those very things are happening, and much worse is happening. As I said earlier, mob lynchings, public murders, and so on are going on, and the killers are not even apprehended or convicted. So it's a much, much worse situation than it ever has been.
I wanted actually to ask you to speak to our young people, a part of the audience, about the way forward. What should we do as not just writers and or lawyers or you know, parliamentarians, but as citizens? Where do you see calls for hope? What is the call you would give out?
You know, in India, we are now seeing uprisings on the part of different groups of citizens from different areas of life, from scientists, from historians, filmmakers, movie stars, women, Dalits. All these people are reacting to this situation, but the communication which is happening between class and mass is significant also. We have a number of civil servants who are taking part in what they call a mohabbat ka safar, a love journey of love, from the northeast to Gandhiji's ashram in Gujarat, which is making common cause with people who have suffered horribly in past massacres and present rapes and killings which are going on. These are all signs of hope. and signs of giving courage to people who've suffered. And apart from that, there are the class we call artists and writers is a very obstinate bunch of people. They will not keep quiet. So we will speak at every opportunity about what is happening, and some of great rationalists, a very fine journalist has recently been murdered. 3 rationalists before that have been murdered. Other writers have been hounded. One writer had a threat that his fingers would be cut off if he continued to write, as he did. All this is going on. We don't care. We are going to keep doing what has to be done, because this society, which since independence has been a society which has given freedom not only of expression, but of religion, of the way to eat, the way to live, the way to dress, whom to fall in love with. All these have been our rights as Indians. We are not giving them up.
Quite right. Let's revisit 2015, Nayantara, when all of us were talking almost every day, and I recall it because it was a moment when it wasn't just writers and academics and historians and filmmakers, but also scientists, which I thought was very important, that everyone came together to say that as a gesture of protest, we will return our state awards. And in protest against not just the murder of the rationalists, this was soon after Kalburgi was killed, but also a clerk, if you remember. And since then, there have been several other murders. So what are the ways, there's a young person in the audience who's asked, what are the ways to defeat Parivar of hate and those murdering writers and reformists? And in answer, I thought perhaps you could revisit that moment, and what are the ways in which we can actually reinvent that? Not by returning awards again, obviously, because I don't think people have any awards left to return. But
well, I think I partly answered that by the last conversation we had, which is that all these movements are going on by various people. I didn't mention Teesta Setalvad, for one, who's fighting, still fighting, for the victims of the Gujarat riots.
That's right.
It's doing, actually taking on the existing horrors which confront us and trying to do something about them, which can, which convinces those people who've suffered that something is being done to help us, and which creates a climate of love in a vitriolic climate of hate.
And also restores the ideology with which the country was created, because you have always pointed out that it's the prevailing ideology which is behind all these numerous changes affecting every aspect of our lives today.
That's right. You know, we can't do it as dramatically as Mahatma Gandhi did in his time. His creation of communication and love was by taking off his clothes and to live half naked for the rest of his life, because that was the way the common Indian lived. He didn't have clothes. So Gandhiji went about in a langot for the rest of his life. And of course, by the practice of abolishing untouchability, which was a huge effort, which still needs to be done in many quarters. So we cannot go to those dramatic extremes. But in many ways of proving our solidarity with our neighbor, a Muslim neighbor or a Christian neighbor, anybody who's in trouble for not being a Hindutva advocate and who needs help, we should give what help we can. either in the way of speaking for them or in terms of actual assistance, legal, as happens with many people. And we have many fine legal minds who are in the fray right now. One of my legal friends was telling me, Vrinda Grover, that 100 lawyers have decided to unite to defend such cases.
In other words, to struggle to make India inclusive again.
To keep it inclusive. We are inclusive. Whatever has been said about Hindutva or Hindu Rashtra, we are not yet a Hindu Rashtra. We are a secular democratic republic. We still are, and that is the way that we plan to remain.
I think that's exactly the message we should end with. Thank you so much, Nayantara, for joining us, and onward to holding on to our inclusive India. Thank you so much for joining us.